I'd like to open it up to questions from anyone. Please raise your hand and we'll give you a mic. Why don't you guys call on whoever you like, whoever you want.
Are we driving this?
Yeah.
How about the gentleman in the front? Are you bringing up a mic for him? Okay.
Yes, please wait for the mic. And also, please, I would like to ask everyone a favor before you ask your question. When we open it up, we want to have as many people have a chance, and we want to hear from the speakers. So I would strongly prefer if everyone would try to say everything they have to say in 30 seconds with just one question and not tell a personal story. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for coming and presenting this wonderful information you're presenting.
Well, it's not on, I'm sorry. Okay. Do you want to, do we have another mic to give?
Do you have it? This better?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay. I just want to thank you for coming and presenting this information that you're presenting, and obviously you both are scholars and you've done extensive work in your fields, and I certainly agree with a lot of what you have to say, and I've done some research myself, so I want to thank you for that. And I just wanted to know, knowing that the extensive research you've done in your areas about antibiotics, there's certainly other aspects of meat that's related to health as well. And knowing that you both are meat eaters, are you open to learning more about the effects of meat on your bodies as well as on the animals and people in general?
Sure. I mean, I think that diet is, finding your optimal diet is a lifelong process, right? And just as you receive more knowledge over time, you receive more knowledge about, or sort of experience about what works and doesn't work for your personal metabolism. So yeah, certainly. Thank you for your question. They're behind you.
Hi, thank you. A minute ago, you just talked about the factory farms that are not using antibiotics, but they still can't compete with the small family farm. And I think my question is, how do we get people to distinguish between chicken that is still being raised in a factory farm situation? They might not be using antibiotics, but it's still not going to be able to compete price-wise with the small family farmer that's really trying to do it the right way. And then I also had a question about an article today in the New York Times in the science section about gut health and bacteria, and it was a really great article. And they're talking about gut health and the microbiome actually affecting your brain as well for Alzheimer's, autism, dementia. And I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about that, so it wouldn't be really bacteria resistant as much as our antibiotics killing our good bacteria that are maybe causing some of the brain problems that we're having.
I can't address the microbiome part. Can you?
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm an expert in that. There's, the list of people that gave blurbs for Maryn's book include a lot of folks in New York City that are really expert. Like Marty Blazer is at NYU. He's actually got a microbiome center, and those are popping up all over the country. So I would direct you to some of the websites. Now, what's true, and what I think you're getting at, is that a lot of the microbiome research isn't really looking directly at diet per se and how diet choices affect the microbiome. They're kind of still in the discovery of like, what is the microbiome and how does it impact health? But unfortunately, they're sort of repeating a pattern of not doing enough research on diet and its impact on health. And that's been a long-standing problem, in part because like the NIH, which funds a lot of the medical research, has not been fond of funding whole diet studies. And so it's been tough for even the biggest, the researchers with the best reputations to get steady funding for those whole diet studies, which is a shame. But it's one reason why we're left kind of to pontificate about how the microbiome is impacted by, X, Y, or Z, rather than actually having data driving our conclusions. We're just not there yet. Remind me of the first part of your question, because I wanted to answer that. Oh, right. 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 So, do you mind?
No, go ahead.
So one of the challenges for all of us is how many of us actually farm? Like very few, right? Less than 1%. Most of us have no idea what's going on farms. All we have to guide our decision making at the grocery store is what we read, and probably more often what's on a label. And so over the last several years, there's been a real trend, a profusion of labels. So it can be tough to wade through what those labels actually say and what they mean. So Consumer Reports has a green labels program that actually wades through all the labels. I recommend that site to you. There are animal welfare labels, like animal welfare approved, for example, and there's
Certified humane.
Certified humane. That's the one I was looking for. Right. Yeah, they're not by labels. I mean a label that carries an audit program where certifiers go out and inspect the farm to make sure that what the label says is actually real world conditions on the farm. Now, the challenge, if you're a small farmer, is who pays for that. And unfortunately, we're still in a position where farmers are having to pay to be able to tell the story of what they're doing to the consumer public. And you're right, it puts them at a competitive disadvantage, especially when they face so many other challenges relative to a really huge producer that tends to produce more conventionally, i.e. with more antibiotics, for example.
Okay. Go ahead.
My question is, I don't know if it's the right question for you, but anyway, the connection between GMOs, the impact on anti-resistant bacteria, because the animals are eating GMO, which creates pesticide factories in the gut and leaky gut syndrome. I'm sure there's a connection, but is there anything that you can say about that?
GMO is a topic that I really stay away from because it's so complicated. Do you have anything to say about this?
I don't. I think all these things are systems, right? So I'm sure there are connections. I'm just not knowledgeable enough about what they are. And I suspect that our society doesn't know the full story yet. So I hate to speculate, but I think one of the real appeals behind like an organic model or other models of farming sustainably is that you can kind of get away from having to prove all those connections and just do something that makes sense from a holistic sustainability standpoint. So, organic, one of the, for example, precepts of an organic model is that you don't bring inputs into your operation, or you try not to, from outside the farm. You try to use as much as you can within the farm. And one of the things that does is that it gives you more awareness of what actually is being used, but it also gives you some reassurance that if there is a problem, it's something you can deal with. It's not somebody else's responsibility. So a lot of these things like antibiotics and GMOs, to me, they fall under kind of that bucket. When you bring stuff in from outside that has its own supply chain, as a farmer, it's just a lot harder for you to have control over what you're doing.
Thank you.
Hello. There is a solution for the problem. There is clean meat, which is completely antibiotic free. It's free of pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, vaccines, and it doesn't cost the earth. It should hit the market shelves this year. Just Inc. Have you heard about it? Josh Tedrick?
So when you say clean meat, do you mean plant-based meat or do you mean lab-grown meat?
No, it's meat that's brewed like beer.
Oh, right.
Lab meat, like cellular agriculture.
It's cellular agriculture, but it has so many advantages, and it actually tastes really good.
So, can I take this?
Yeah, please.
I'm a skeptic of technological optimism. I have spoken to a number of the clean meat experimenters. But by clean meat, what we're talking about here is animal cells that are grown in a dish, basically, right? Animal cells grown outside an animal. And I've tasted some of the prototypes. They're delicious, or at least interesting, and they have been produced in very small quantities. Where I think the real danger is I don't see any evidence yet that lab-grown meat can scale without the use of antibiotics. Once you start growing something in giant reactors, your chance of contamination and of the need to keep down inappropriate organisms becomes orders of magnitude more difficult than when you're talking about a reactor the size of a shoebox. So I think the case is not proven. And for myself, I'm going to have to see a lot more evidence that clean meat can do things at the scale that it says that it can for it to actually be a solution. But I also have a couple more, not so much objections as questions to raise. The first is, though, as David said, a relatively small proportion of our society farms relative to those who farmed 100 years ago, we still have a lot of people producing animal protein. What are you going to do with those people if we're going to grow protein in a dish? We need to do, the clean meat solution has to be in part, what do you do with the farming economy that we have? And my biggest, and again, this is my concern for the unfilled promises of technological optimism, is that though at the moment the genetics of chicken and turkey are owned by a couple of multinationals, pork and beef and lamb and duck are all open source foods, right? They're not closed, dead-end foods like GMO seeds, where you can't breed one seed from the next and you have to go back to the company for each crop. You have to do that for chickens, but pigs and cattle reproduce naturally. Lab-grown meat is intellectual property. It's going to belong to very large companies. It's going to belong to tech companies. I am not convinced, especially given the events of the past couple of years, that tech companies are necessarily the best guardians of the public good. Making food become intellectual property, that is a trend that I would like to see less of, not more of. And I am concerned, thank you, that lab meat can take us in the direction of food being more intellectual property rather than less. That is probably a minority view.
What she said.
Thank you.
No, I mean, you're in New York. I assume most of you are in New York. There's still a lot of small-scale production up north of here. I know that. But in a state like Minnesota, which is a largish state, you go 3 hours west of the Twin Cities, and boy, those communities are suffering. And they've been suffering for a really, really long time because the marketplace, most of them were mostly corn and soybeans, but they don't actually make money on corn and soybeans without government payment programs and insurance programs. the marketplace does not give them a price that keeps them on their land and in their home. So meat was always the thing that they could do on the side that would actually make money, and it tended to be counter-cyclical. So I don't know if that's still true, but that means that when the markets for the row crops were bad, the meat prices tended to be up. So the fact that now the biggest market for pork, for example, is shut down, or was shut down, and we export 1/3 of our pork. Now, I have other issues with that. I don't think that's such a good thing. But the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of families who raise pork who are really hurting. And I agree that it's only going to increase the strife and the level of angst in rural America to have that continue to be a situation.
Shall we go to this side? And then we'll come back over here.
My glasses, hold on. There's something that you said that really caught my interest in terms of our focus over here with the 5G next generation technology with the EMF pollution. Because one of the outcomes, if this is released, is that there's going to be many more skin diseases because of the small millimeter wavelength. And you said that there was going to be an issue if there's interruptions in the protection of the skin. And could you explain what that is? That there's a gateway of some kind, and I'm very concerned about the connection between what you're saying and what we know is going to happen. There's going to be more skin infection.
Do you know which of us that was?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics, but I mean, the skin is the largest immune organ in the body, right? So it's not only a physical barrier, but it's like the first line of immune defense. So all of us are constantly nicking our skin. Now, fortunately, it's pretty resilient, but yeah, it's always been a potential portal for infection. And with a general increase in resistant bacteria, I suppose that that makes those bacteria more of a threat, I guess, through skin entrance. But there's lots of ways they can enter the body. They can enter when you scratch your nose. They can enter when you rub your eye. They can enter through what you eat, and then they can enter via your skin as well.
Let's go to this side, I think.
I just have a question about, well, it's a two-part question. One is, I have chickens myself, and I know that they are very hard to keep clean. So are you concerned at all about the mass production in the chicken without the antibiotics and the infection? And how do you feel about essential oils for managing infection? And then when it comes to superbugs, isn't it important that we maintain optimal health for keeping them at bay, or how do you feel about that?
So David mentioned Perdue Chicken. Perdue is the 4th largest chicken company in the United States, based in Salisbury, Maryland, out in that part of the East Coast where Maryland and Delaware and Virginia all come together, the Delmarva Peninsula. And they're a family-owned company, which makes them a little more nimble. They don't have the pressure of Wall Street breathing down their necks. In 2014, Perdue, the chairman, Jim Perdue, do people remember the Frank Perdue commercials? Remember, yeah, you just now have confessed how old you all are, but I remember them too, so we'll all be old together. So the current chairman is the son of Frank Perdue. It takes a tough man to make a tender chicken, and the grandson of the founder. And in 2014, he called a press conference and he announced that they were taking their entire company antibiotic-free. In fact, that they had been quietly doing research for a decade to prove that they could do this. And they now, so that was 5 years ago, and they have in fact accomplished this. As they moved through going antibiotic-free, they discovered some really interesting things, which was that in order to sustain the birds' immune systems in the absence of antibiotics, they had to go back to kind of older farm practices. Now, they're still raising millions of chickens a week in barns that hold 30,000 chickens at a time, but they changed the birds' diets. They made their diets a lot more pure. They gave them more vaccines. They gave them things to exercise on. They cut windows in the barns so the birds could get sunlight on their feathers, which may induce some vitamin production, but certainly makes them feel better. And they added to their diets a number of sort of natural antiseptics, among which are yucca and cinnamon and oregano oil and thyme oil. In fact, antibiotic-free producers are now buying so much oregano and thyme that I'm kind of waiting for a counterfeit market to start. Because the natural oils in those herbs are sort of natural sterilizers. And it's worked brilliantly. I mean, you go into a chicken house now. I have been in a number of these chicken houses, as the barns are called, and it smells like a pizzeria because they're using so many herbs. I don't know anything about purified essential oils, but there's and anything outside of those particular herbs, but there definitely is a botanical component to what the big chicken producers are doing now. I don't know anything about essential oils otherwise, though. Over here?
Thank you for the information. All right, I have a question. You know, over the years, I've read many books about the fact that we are in great danger because many of these bugs are becoming antibiotic resistant. So I want to ask you about a few natural alternatives. One you mentioned is oil of oregano, colloidal silver, manuka honey, propolis, and usnea. I've read that usnea is very good for strep. So I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So rather than address the individual botanicals, let me say this. Since this is an audience interested in natural products, you probably know this already much better than I do. But the regulation and standard setting of botanical products in the United States is nowhere near as good as it is, for instance, in Europe, in Germany in particular. That means that one of the problems that creates is that there aren't good products to do reliable scientific testing on. And also, because these products are sold under a supplement scheme and not under a pharmaceutical scheme, they don't make anywhere near as much money for companies, and therefore it's not productive to do scientific testing on them. Therefore, there have been relatively few trials putting natural products, natural antiseptics, up against antibiotics. Where there have been trials, which is largely outside the United States, for things like thymol, the active ingredient in thyme oil, essentially, and the active ingredient in manuka honey, what they show is that you can misuse those in the same way that you can misuse antibiotics, that they are, in the end, a chemical compound. And bacteria will adapt to them and learn to defend themselves against them in the same way that they will learn to defend themselves against an antibiotic. So, so I think I'll just stop there. Did you have anything to say about that?
No, that about captures my inability to directly answer the specifics too.
On this side?
I would say that, I've had a lot of interactions with medical colleagues who have gotten functional medicine training and integrative medicine training, and it took allopathic medicine is what we typically refer to as physicians in the U.S. There are other traditions, osteopathy, homeopathy, naturopathy. Allopaths have been very late to the game to learning about things like botanicals, to learning about nutrition, but they are the ones within the medical community who have been working to try to integrate that knowledge base with what you read in the New England Journal of Medicine. I think we're very early in that process, but it's really exciting. And, for those who want to get that kind of a question answered, I think the integrative medicine community in general is very good at that. And there's probably a lot of those folks here.
Was there someone on this?
Yeah, hi.
Oh, there you are.
I'm here. I've read some studies, but not really much.
Lift the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Does wireless radiation create more antibiotic-resistant bacteria? I thought I had seen some studies on that, and I don't know how well-founded those are. Can you comment?
I've never heard that.
I have never heard that. I would have to see a study.
And I left it printed in my printer at home, so I'm very sorry, because I made copies for you. But maybe I'll email it. Are drug-resistant bacteria also more aggressive bacteria?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. The answer is sometimes.
Okay.
Right.
But, I mean, sometimes they are also more virulent. But that is kind of context dependent.
Right.
So you may have a bacterium that is resistant to multiple antibiotics, but is not necessarily more virulent, causing more severe disease than one that is not resistant. We get in it's kind of a trap of thinking that like drug-resistant infections are the really big bad, but in the case of resistant staph and plain garden staph, sort of sensitive staph is also a really dangerous infection. And we tend to forget that because we think drug resistance is the worst. At least, having written a book about staph, I think that, and I'm wrong.
And if I could just squeeze this in, I thought that exposing myself a little bit to germs and not being so germ-phobic would help my immune system. And based upon what you were saying about the bacteria hanging out in your body for months and years and then coming out later, maybe that's not such a good idea for me to want to expose myself a little bit more to create my immunity.
Yeah. Okay, so David a few minutes ago mentioned Martin Blazer, who is a professor and the head of the Microbiome Center at NYU's medical school, what's now called the Langone Medical School. He wrote an amazing book called Missing Microbes, which I really recommend reading. It's a very sort of mass audience friendly book, even though it was written by a highly degreed researcher. In that book, he explores what's usually called the hygiene hypothesis, which is a contention that our lives have gotten too clean, and that because we are so obsessed with cleanliness and getting rid of bacteria and wiping our kids down and not letting them roll around in the dirt, that we have accidentally induced an epidemic of allergy and autoimmune diseases. And what's behind that is the sense, supported by a bunch of mostly observational studies, so not experiments, but watching people living their daily lives, that if children are exposed early in their lives, when their immune systems are still developing and figuring out the world, to the kind of microbes that we routinely encountered as we were evolving, they will have more robust immune systems that are better balanced. And the evidence for this is things like younger children in a family have fewer allergies than older children because the older children are bringing infections home from daycare. Kids who grow up with pets have fewer allergies than kids that grow up without pets. Kids that grow up on farms have fewer allergies than kids that live in the city. All of those are, what lies behind all of those is sort of this sense of the immune system coming to terms with insults in the environment and learning how to live in peace with them. But the key thing about that is that all of that, for that to work, all of that exposure happens pretty early in life. So you're probably not going to affect your immune response to something one way or another by letting yourself get more or less dirty or more or less covered in germs. Allowing for the fact that different there are different flora in different parts of the world, and that, you may become habituated to the local flora here and then like travel somewhere else and suddenly find you're having a sneezing fit because you're not accustomed to what you're breathing or encountering there.
So in other words, only your kids get to claim the 5-second rule, but you can't.
I've sort of lost track. Wait, who has the microphone? Anyone? So just hand them to people with the gentleman in the tie-dye here and the woman in the orange, and then we'll send one over that way.
Hi. I just had a question regarding MRSA. I know it used to be considered hospital-acquired, and now it's jumped to being community-acquired. And my question was, I never quite understood that, like how all of a sudden it wasn't hospital-acquired anymore. It was, and I understand how you explained how it manifested itself based on possibly being more immunosuppressed in the hospital. I understand all that, but how did it end up going to be a community-acquired where you say, like, for example, a football player can get it, or I just don't understand that.
I wrote a book about this.
Really?
So it's a pretty complicated story, but the key thing to keep in mind is that staph, the S in MRSA, is a bacterium that loves to live on our skin, right? So we can carry it with us very easily, usually without knowing it, and we can carry it with us in and out of hospitals. When the researchers who first identified community staph got their hands on the earliest strains that were identified, this is in the mid-90s in Chicago, and analyzed them, they discovered that there had been a couple of key genetic changes between the strains that were flourishing in hospitals and the strains that were now coming into emergency rooms on kids from the community. It's important that it was in emergency rooms because if someone's in an emergency room, they didn't come from somewhere else in the hospital. They came from the outside world. And those genetic changes the bug had shed some of the resistances that it had because it was no longer being exposed to some of the antibiotics that would be routinely used in the hospital. But what it had gained the ability to live in the more sort of like rough and tumble outer world of sort of the everyday world where things aren't super clean. Aside from that, I recommend my book, Superbug. I'm sorry.
Well,
Publishers always say, at some point you have to say, as I say in my book.
But I think I would like to add in, and actually I hope I don't put you on the spot, but there's an interesting sideline example, and that is livestock-associated MRSA in the Netherlands. So, and you've written about this, so do you mind telling that story? It's in Big Chicken.
Right, so there's hospital-acquired MRSA, there's community-acquired MRSA. When medicine says community, they mean anywhere outside a hospital. Amazing, we should speak, okay. Uh-huh.
So even though I understand it, I just figured that maybe I'd get another answer that I'd understand it a little more, because I still don't quite get it, but now I understand a little more. But
evolution is smarter than we are is the short version. So what David was referring to is that there's a third strain of MRSA, which was identified first in the Netherlands, but now has moved around the world, that actually surfaced in pigs first. Pigs and humans have very similar respiratory systems. And the pigs were being given tetracycline as a preventive and growth promoter, and it caused the MRSA in their systems to become tetracycline resistant, and then it crossed into humans and caused a massive outbreak in healthcare in the Netherlands.
So you'd appreciate this. I don't know if this is still true, but You know, several years ago, it was the case that if you entered the hospital for whatever reason in the Netherlands, and they were doing an intake interview, and they realized that you were either a farmer or had some exposure to a farm, they put you right into isolation until they could show with cultures that you were not MRSA positive.
Thank you for your question. Go ahead.
I don't know if I'm saying it properly, but how does somebody deal with antibiotics after a really bad reaction from antibiotics? Allergic reactions.
Say it again, I didn't understand.
If you got an allergic reaction from antibiotics, how do you take new ones, like without worrying about getting that similar type of reaction?
Well, allergies are usually specific to particular proteins, so they're antibiotic specific. Now there's some exceptions, like there's often cross-reactivity in an allergic sense between penicillins and cephalosporins, for example, amoxicillin and cephalosporins. So, but in other cases, just because you had a bad reaction to one antibiotic doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have that same reaction to different antibiotics. You kind of have to have specialized testing to evaluate that, which from your standpoint would be important because you really do want to know which antibiotic you can take safely, and you don't want to be in the situation of being really sick and trying to answer that question. It's much better to answer it now while you're healthy.
So pharmacologists talk about antibiotics as existing in families. And what defines an antibiotic family is there's something in the core molecule of the compound that's the same. So penicillin, amoxicillin, methicillin, all the illins have a particular arrangement of atoms at their core. Aminoglycosides have a different one, macrolides have a different one. So it might be that if you were allergic to penicillin, pulling something out of the air here, you might also be allergic to all the other psyllins, but you might be able to take vancomycin because it's in a different family and it's got a different, and the cephalosporins have that same molecule as the penicillins do.
I think two families have got me so far, so.
Sorry.
No, that's what
Good
I was
luck.
asking.
Is there someone on this side? Is it? No one on this side? You don't have a microphone though, do you? Now he does, okay.
Hi. Well, I just want to add to something that you said a few minutes ago. Okay. Basically is that kids, as soon as they are babies, 1-year-old, they get antibiotics. And what happens is when they're so young and while they're growing, their body, when they really need an antibiotic, will not be able to fight what they have to fight against any kind of germs or any kind of infection. So basically what we're bringing kids not to be immune to all kind of germs in our society. So what I think is we have to stop giving children and let them grow and for the body to develop its own immune system against all those things, and we don't have to take them every time. I mean, we have a tooth pain or an infection from a cat or whatever, things like that.
So the researcher that I mentioned, Dr. Martin Blazer at NYU Langone, agrees with you. One of the prescriptions at the end of his book is that to the degree possible, parents should try to delay their children's first doses of antibiotics, precisely so that they won't interfere with the adaptation of the immune system to the environment. So thank you for your comment.
Thanks.
Anyone over here? I don't see any more hands. No more hands?
I think we're at.
Oh, no, one more hand. Okay. One. Stephen, I think this is our last question.
Yeah.
So-
Okay, you had mentioned human antibiotics, and I know on labels, sometimes it will say no human antibiotic used. but there's a lot of antibiotics that are used only for animals. Can you talk a little bit about that? How many antibiotics are used just for animals, and can they get away with saying no human antibiotics, that you think there's no antibiotics, but there's really antibiotics?
Good point. Well, if you can talk about Purdue, are they using any?
No.
So,
They're not. No, yes, I can talk about it, but no, they're not using it. So the main point here is that, you know, the most important reason to reduce antibiotic use in livestock is to slow down the generation of resistant bacteria that will be a threat to humans because we have taken away the power of the antibiotics that we would use to treat an infection. Therefore, you know, things like penicillin, streptomycin, the tetracyclines being used in animals is bad because those are antibiotics that we would have prescribed to us against infections. That's, you know, human antibiotics or human use antibiotics that's what that's shorthand for. There are other categories of antibiotics that are used in animal agriculture that those antibiotics are not used, they're not approved by the FDA for use in humans. And therefore, whether resistance develops or not is kind of irrelevant because we would never need that drug. We would never be able to use that drug. The best real-world example of this is a class of drugs called ionophores, which are used in, they're a growth promoter in cattle. But in chickens, they are used to reduce, not eliminate, but reduce the incidence of a parasitic disease called coccidiomycosis, which basically, it's a parasite that takes up residence in the gut and causes bleeding lesions in the gut that can be a doorway for other infection to start up and ruin a chicken's its uptake of nutrition. When the European Union banned growth promoter antibiotics in 2006, they kicked the can down the road for antibiotics, for ionophores, for at least 10 years, precisely because they thought they weren't a human health risk. In the United States, where the biggest movement against antibiotics, as David said, has been in the chicken companies, Purdue went fully antibiotic-free right away, but Tyson, which is bigger than Purdue, initially said, we're going to take out human-use antibiotics, but we're going to keep ionophores because we can't figure out how to do production at our scale without them. They subsequently went further and took out ionophores as well. If you look at the policies of some of the fast food companies that are buying chicken, some of them, like, I'm not sure that McDonald's, I don't know, what does the report card say? Some of the companies are buying fully no antibiotics ever chicken. Some of the companies are contracting for no human use antibiotics, but they're allowing ionophores in their suppliers.
basically, the driver behind what you just heard is that whether it's the Purdue's or the retail companies like McDonald's, they find it really hard to communicate the nuances to the public of what the difference is between medically and non-medically important. So some of them just flat out say, it's easier for us just to do no antibiotics ever, because it's easier to communicate. You know, regardless of what you think about the other reasons, that's kind of their thinking. Thank you.